hello again, and welcome to another episode of TIO Talks. I'm your host, Warwick Powell, and what a treat we have today. Joining us to talk about the recently held elections in Japan and all of the implications resulting from it is my very good friend, Pascal Lottaz. Pascal has been traveling across continents and has been kind enough to make time for us today to walk us through what the issues are. Pascal, as many of you know, is the host of Neutrality Studies and is also an international relations scholar based in Japan. Pascal is a peace activist, and I've had the pleasure of being on the receiving end of questions on a number of occasions. So it's high time that I got to throw a few curly ones at Pascal, especially after a long flight. Thanks for joining me, Pascal. Hey, it's Warwick Powell here from TIO Talks. I just wanted to ask for your help. Algorithms are an amazing thing. They really help drive traffic from one channel to another, from one show to another. But sometimes we need to help the algorithm out, if you know what I mean. And it would be very helpful for the channel and for the kind of messages that we want to spread and for the education that we want to provide globally if you could like the channel and perhaps even subscribe to it.
Hello, Warwick, and thank you very much for having me.
We've just had an election in Japan, and the LDP, led by Takaichi, has come out with an absolute whopper of a majority. But election systems are interesting in and of themselves because they often create certain kinds of effects by the way that they're designed. So perhaps the first thing we'll do, Pascal, is ask you to walk us through what the numbers are, how the system works, and what the ramifications are of the result itself.
Okay, my pleasure. So this was a pretty big deal because this was not a regular parliamentary election in the sense that it wasn't pre-scheduled. So one of the powers the prime minister has is that he or she, in this case, can dissolve parliament at will, which opens up this space for electoral gambles. And that's what Takaichi, Sanae Takaichi, the person who became prime minister in October 2025, so barely 3-4 months ago, right? She came in and she became the head of the Liberal Democratic Party, and then she actually soared in her popularity and decided in the end to take the gamble and dissolve parliament and then call for this snap election, which is an election of the lower house, the House of Representatives. So Japan has a bicameral system, but the lower house is the bigger one and it's the more important one. Because it has certain powers according to the constitution that it allows it to win over the upper house. So whoever controls the lower house is usually looked at as the governing entity, and the Liberal Democratic Party before had a majority together with its coalition partner, but in the upper house elections of last year, they actually lost quite a lot of popularity, and that was one of the main reasons why the previous prime minister stepped down, and how Takaichi came in the first place. Now, the lower house, one of the biggest question was, we knew from the polling that she would gain quite a few seats. The question was, would she make it to 50% for the LDP, and would she maybe even make it to 2/3, which then means if she got that with a 2/3 majority, you can actually overwrite bills coming from the upper house, right? So you basically gain control over the legislative. And indeed, she won that. She won 316 out of 465 seats, which puts her 6 seats above a 2/3 majority. So she won for the LDP alone, without a coalition partner, just alone, more than 2/3, which is really the largest victory of a single party since the Second World War, since the current system was inaugurated. She is still in a coalition with a smaller party, the Ishin party, which then adds and now about 35 or so on more seats. So she now, with her coalition partner, has about almost 3/4 of the lower house behind her. But as you said, there are reasons for this, and it's not just her personal popularity. The most important thing to understand is that Japan, the lower house elections run mainly on a first past the post system. Actually, it's a mixed system, but first past the post is the bigger part, meaning that the districts that these candidates run in is one district, one candidate who will win, which then usually, not just in the Japanese case, but also in the UK and so on, translates to unfair results for the largest party, because the largest party might win with just a small margin each district, but that then gives you basically control over a lot of seats in parliament, and that's exactly what happened over here. The LDP did gain popularity, no question, but we know that it is far away from a two-thirds majority, from a two-thirds popularity in the general population. We know that because the mixed system, first past the post, is mixed with list voting. They do both at the same time. So list voting functions with larger districts, and then 2 or 3 or 4 candidates from a list will be elected, which then means we have more of a representative result. And thanks to the lists, we actually know what the preferences of people on the ground are. In the list voting, she got 36% of votes, right? That put in people who said, I want the LDP to win, I want the LDP candidates to go to parliament. In the first past the post system, she won 49% of votes. And so you can see how 36 in a list voting then translates to 34 and 49 first past the post, which then, due to the way you distribute the seats, translates to 2/3. So that's how you go from 36% to over 66%. It's a translation issue, as I usually call that, because the exercise of parliamentary democracy is to translate a large group of people, that's the 120 million Japanese, into a chamber of 465 people, right? So how do you do that? And the Japanese system does benefit the largest party, although the largest party in what we've got now is a party that commands basically a little bit more than a third of sympathies of the voting population. And I must also emphasize this, because we only have 55 or 56% of participation rate. So only a little bit more than half of the eligible voters in Japan actually turned up to vote. And out of those, of that half, she gained about 36% voted for the LDP. But now in the parliament, this translates to over 66%. It's called the winner's bonus.
Quick question. Is it the 36% of the 55%, which would make it, 1/3 of 55, or is it 36% of total eligible?
No, it's 36% of those who voted. I mean, this is the number that we got through the list proportional voting. So
it's 1/3 roughly of, or a little bit more than 1/3 of the 55% that voted, which would make it a little bit less than 20% of actual adults who are eligible to vote.
Right, who bothered to vote for her? It does make sense to extrapolate that and say, like, okay, also of the 100% of voters, probably she would have gained something around the same number. So we can say that around a third of the Japanese support the LDP, and 2/3 don't. So as on the ground. So that's very important to keep in mind. And it's also important for her to keep in mind, because yes, she has a large mandate now. She won a landslide victory, and it will give her political possibilities in parliament, but that does not mean that she commands the totality of the population, and she will still have to take that into consideration. And actually, what she said right after the election gives us a hint that she's aware of that. She said that even though she has this large majority, she will still listen to the opposition parties, to the smaller parties in the Diet, and not just steamroll over them. At least that's what she's promising now. And she's also not trying to dissolve the coalition with the Ishin party, even though she doesn't need them anymore. She could just form a cabinet made of her own ministers, but she said, no, this will stand. We will govern together. So she seems to want to create more of a government of unity. She won't include people from the other parties, but she won't throw the coalition partner out, and she at least signals that she will still listen to what the other parties have to say.
Now, she, of course, is a seasoned politician in Japan, very well
Yes.
known, with a very high profile, and she comes from a part of the body politic that I guess, from an external observer's point of view, would be described as leaning towards the right and from the nationalist bent. How do you think that is likely to play out in terms of some of her priorities, as well as some of the challenges she may have domestically, at least? I know that she, of course, confronts, as many Japanese administrations before her, major economic challenges. The standard of living in Japan is very, very high, but the economy nonetheless still feels like it's very much treading water. It delivers a high standard of living, but it doesn't seem to be going very far, very fast. And this has been a challenge for governments for the past 20 plus years. Now, she promised a lot of different things coming into this election to tackle the economic challenges of Japan. Firstly, what were some of her keynote commitments? And to what extent do you think they are going to be ones that will actually deliver on the ground and consolidate her electoral mandate, as opposed to perhaps begin to take the mandate a little bit for granted as time goes by?
Um, she now stands in front of a mountain of work. Also, because now the expectations are very high, and several analysts in Japan actually pointed out, look, she didn't run very much on policies or for this against that. She had that, she has that, but compared to other elections, it was much less what she actually wants to do, and much more about the hope that she inspires by being relatively young and relatively fresh. She looks different from some of her predecessors, who were like men in their 70s, and quite stern figures. And she looks a bit more fresh. And she was riding on that, and she now will have to work on this. And she has to work on it not only with some of the parties, but also inside her party. The LDP is large, and used to be separated into factions. Even like officially, the previous governments kind of dissolved these factions, but naturally these inner intra-party coalitions are forming again. She has, in her last cabinet, and I suppose she will carry over most of these people, she actually made a point out of appointing internal rivals into political positions, like Mr. Koizumi, the son of former Prime Minister Koizumi. Currently, she appointed him Minister of Defense, and I suppose he will continue serving as that, although he's her strongest rival within the party, and definitely waiting in the party to until it's his turn, because he's still relatively young. But you can see how she's trying to kind of form a coalition that somehow then also makes it possible for the LDP as a party to run, because the factions have been dissolved recently. Actually, the pressure on individual parliamentarians to vote in one way or another is a bit less. So she might actually lose certain policy issues if she cannot rally enough support of her own party. It's not a one-party state. She's it's not under that tight a control. Of course, she will try to do this. Now, to come to your question here, is that when it comes to social policies, almost all of Japan's parties, the LDP included, are actually more or less social democrats. So they all promise money to the general population. Even though she's from a conservative party, that conservative party is not fiscally conservative. There are certain people in her party, especially the Ministry of Finance is actually relatively conservative when it comes to that. But she herself and her group actually promised a lot of spending. So it's the one thing that all parties agreed upon is we need to spend more on social welfare. The question was, how do we do it? And certain parties said, oh, we should do it by tax cuts, and others said, no, we should just do it by additional expenditures. But the funny thing is, the Japanese, they all agree, no, we need to help the population, which naturally means even more debt, national debt. And Japan is already the most indebted country in the world, 230-40% of GDP. But the Japanese do not buy the neoclassical narrative that high debt to GDP automatically means that you will ruin your country. Not at all. They actually have been doing this now for a long time, and they're set to continue this. So what she has to deliver is probably she will try to reduce the consumption tax from currently 10% to 8% in order to alleviate a little bit of stress, especially on families and so on, for everyday spending. It's possible that she will come up with different policies with just lump sum payments for certain categories. This is yet to be seen. In the foreign policy realm, actually, I think one of the largest opportunities she has is to find a new working relationship with China, because before she was, even within her party, relatively weak. She was one of several people who could be the leader of the party, and now that she delivered this large victory and she helped so many people to gain a seat in parliament, actually, I think she has more leeway. And this is one thing that when I watched Japanese TV just the other day and this morning, that some analysts were saying, look, this is probably also a mandate to somehow find a working relationship, because the economy must work. They need to get it to work, and there are several policies that she's in favor of. Funnily enough, she's in favor of weak yen. She keeps saying this is very good for our export industry, and she also, certain analysts made a point out of showing that there are certain industries that are coming back to Japan. Chip manufacturing, most importantly, TSMC from Taiwan built a huge plant in, I think, Kumamoto. And it's very large, and Japan has this lithography industry, which they apparently now want to use in order to produce more chips domestically. Used to be only 7-nanometer chips, and they want to go now to 3 nanometers and produce those in Japan. You can see how there's a strategy behind trying to re-industrialize and bring some of these supply chains also back to Japan. This is going to be a very difficult thing to do, and there's huge challenges, especially also when it comes to energy, because Japan is of course dependent on energy, dependent on labor, also to some extent. So she will have to tread very careful water. And when it comes to China, I do believe that, what happened recently in December, when she had this gaffe in the diet in Parliament, and basically said that an attack, Chinese mainland military attack on Taiwan would be regarded as a national emergency for Japan, and they would deploy their military forces. I do think that she and a lot of people in the LDP are not happy that is out, and that it then led to such a huge backlash from China. And although they are not apologizing, and I don't think an apology is actually on the table, because it would just be, you would lose too much face, there are several ways in which the LDP and her government already indicated that they would like to mend ties with China. Quietly, the Chinese said, like, no, you need to say so out loud. But if there is willingness from the Chinese side to go to a working relationship, I think the chances are actually quite good. Because yes, she's a nationalist, but she's not the type of, I don't see her as the type of Second World War revisionist, Japan should have won, and if we need, we go to war again type of idiot nationalist. She's the kind of, she's a protege of Mr. Abe, Shinzo Abe. She came she became big in the party under him, and he did appoint her as a minister before, and I see her in that tradition of those type of pragmatic nationalists who will try to look at how to further the interests of Japan. And actually, her Minister of Defense, Mr. Koizumi, in the first speech after the election, made the point: look, we are not just downstream from the United States. We have our own interests, and we will try to work on those. And I found that a not unimportant comment to make, even though the question whether they can do it or not is a different one. But you can see how Japan has somewhat might look like Germany of the East, but it doesn't function like that, in my view.
I'll come back to its relationship with the US in a tick, but I want to dive into this China question a little bit, because not only does it have security implications at a regional level, but in terms of Japan's own economic challenges, having a functional, stable, dependable relationship with China is actually vitally important. Japan has some challenges and ambitions. You mentioned its ambitions around reindustrialization, which presupposes successful electrification and getting energy costs down. Japan has an aging population, which requires actually a shift down the robotization or automation pathway to be able to meet the social services needs of the population at large. And of course, it also has significant upstream dependencies on Chinese raw material supplies, even into things like the semiconductor market. So, on all of those key fronts, strategic fronts, um, uh, having a functional relationship with China seems to be pivotal. The last thing I'll say, or the last proposition in all of this, is that, and this goes back to the Asian financial crisis of 97, 98. Out of that, when the countries of the region experienced a very significant liquidity crisis, which was a shortage of US dollars. Incidentally, other parts of the world have recently experienced US dollar shortages engineered by the US Treasury, but we can leave that to one side today. But Japan, South Korea, China in particular, among some of the other nations in Southeast Asia, understood that they actually need to coordinate the financial architectures to mitigate the long-term risks of dollar exposure and liquidity crises. So you package all of that together, and you've actually got a real need for Japan in terms of its own nationalistic ambitions to settle its arrangements with China. So across those fronts, how do you see the majority that she now has enabling her to perhaps find some wriggle room?
I think this is it. I mean, she gained wiggle room with this mandate that she got, and on the one hand, there will be probably some you would maybe call it like populist policies on the one, but on the other, um, she now has what she needs in order to take some strategic decisions of how to position Japan in a way that it can well continue to thrive in its environment. And it, I find it quite interesting. I mean, my YouTube channel is called Neutrality Studies. My academic work is on neutrality, and somehow I see that Japan naturally is drifting into something like a out of necessity, something like a neutral space. I don't mean neutral of the type of Switzerland, but I mean neutral in the sense that Japan has an interest in vectoral diplomacy, right, and foreign policy. On the one hand, the security relationship with the United States is very important, and actually the Japanese also in like now all of the analysis actually pointed out, look, the biggest first test is now going to be Donald Trump's visit, who will come to Japan first and then go to China, right, to meet with Xi Jinping, and this fact that he comes first to Japan, or no, sorry, that's not true. She will go to the United States. I think that's the point, and then he will actually meet Xi Jinping after that in April. That this is a relatively well, that's going to be a test of how things will move forward. And the Japanese are aware that the security relationship with the United States is important. On the other hand, they do not perceive them anymore as reliable. So even though it's important, it's kind of a backbone of Japanese security thinking, the doubts toward the longevity of this alliance are now real, and Japan is trying to move into a little bit more independent space, which is on the one hand, it might loosen the dependency on the US. On the other hand, of course, it creates this insecurity in Asia, especially in China and also South Korea, by the way, about this revisionism of Japan. So what I'm not sure is how much of that she actually sees, how well she and the LDP people around her understand the perceptions from abroad. Japan is historically poor at understanding how other nations perceive them, and kind of have these discussions among themselves, and then do a policy, supposing that everybody understands this policy the way that they do. Now, I do hope that on this
They're
point,
probably not alone in that limitation.
yeah, it's just like Japan, like really, like also historically has a lot of misunderstandings of how others perceive them, or how political the political game abroad then works, and how it creates backlash. So I do hope that she will rely on a very capable foreign ministry, and not only foreign ministry, actually, also they have a very capable agency for development, development agency, JICA, the Japanese arm for, the Japanese version of USAID, although in the Japanese case, it's not in order to meddle in foreign affairs, but basically create trade structures with developing nations, especially in Southeast Asia and Africa. And they have very capable people who also understand the politics on the ground. And I do hope that she will rely on information from them in order then to figure out how to create also a working relationship with China. We know that she's trying to mend fences with the South Korea. The one thing the Japanese are really afraid of is North Korea, but a good relationship with China could actually help ameliorate also that. So having a more or less independent foreign policy in several directions will benefit Japan. And actually, she and her team also said that they didn't really use the term Japan first or make Japan great again, but the idea that Japan as a nation needs to be able to prosper, that was very clear in her messaging. And I think that's why I perceive her as a nationalist, but a nationalist in the sense of the good of Japan comes first. However, how you do that is, of course, the question, and the trade relationship with China is going to be important, and I'm sure she's aware of that.
Well, it's not just trade, of course. There are many Japanese companies that make a substantial amount of
Yes.
money, and in fact,
Yes.
by being in China.
Yes.
It seems to me that there's a couple of interesting things here that I'd really like to tease out with you. One is this issue of a contemporary Japanese nationalism, which is seeking to find a space for it to express itself, particularly from out of the shadow of American occupation. And the Americans are still there, of course, but to find a more independent pathway. We know that her predecessor flagged some very interesting propositions to try to push the envelope, if you will, talking about the relationship between the US and Japan needing to become one of normal countries. Didn't go down so well in Washington, but nonetheless, it was an attempt to push and create more elbow room, if you will. That's one dimension. Her second dimension, though, of course, is there are political forces domestically that see possibly the opportunity to push a lot harder on capital N nationalism. And then there are the regional sensitivity issues. So the pathway that, in a sense, exists for the government of Japan is one that has many minds scattered along it, because it's needing to bring on board, if you will, or ameliorate a series of potential concerns which are not consistent with each other. How do you, and the other thing you mentioned, of course, is that there is a depth of, let's call it, public bureaucracy capability. which has been there for decades. How do you see all of that coming together? And what's your sense of the likelihood that a Takaichi administration will be able to begin a more effective pathway of navigating a more autonomous Japan that doesn't, on the one hand, alienate the United States too quickly, and at the same time, doesn't cause regional actors, and particularly China, to become intensely concerned about Japanese wartime revisionism?
Um, Let me put it like this: her mentor Shinzo Abe was actually relatively successful at doing just that with the large mandate that he won back in 2012, 2013,
Mm,
to then translate this into a foreign policy which had Japan been under a left wing government, would have been much harder to do. I mean, he even opened up again the discussion about the comfort women with South Korea in order to somehow overcome this issue, which is really something that stands in the way of the trilateral relationship, South Korea, Japan, United States. And this was very unpopular within the right wing of the LDP, from which he stems, but he did it out of necessity and because he could. He was able to push that. And she, in a sense, now has a similar possibility to alienate some people on the right in order to get through policies that are important. She won't do all of them. She's certainly still kind of a right-wing hawkish conservative, but on the other hand, the policies that we've seen over the past are simply going to be are confirmed and will probably continue to roll on. It's also important. I mean, the LDP has been in power for most of the last 65, 70 years, really for a very, very long time, which then, of course, includes all of the appointment in the administration, in the bureaucratic level. Japan is quite special in this sense that all of the vice ministers, each minister with their portfolios, tend to have about 4 vice ministers for each one, and those are bureaucrats. They're not actually elected; they're selected, and they go through the ranks within their ministries, right? So the policies that we've seen in the past, in that sense, will carry on. And what we've seen is that Japan is making this shift from dependence, ironclad dependence on the U.S. security umbrella to do more by yourself. And there's 2 schools of thoughts in Japan on why this is important. The first school says it's important because we need to take more responsibility within the alliance. Japan used to be the shield and the United States is the sword, and we now also need to become a sword in order to support the United States more. There's a second school, and they are saying, like, we need to do this because we cannot rely on the Americans anymore. If push comes to shove and they close the umbrella, we need to be able to have our own little umbrella, right? And we need to work on building that up. And that's why both of these schools, they don't work against each other very much. They just have also a different interpretation of what the future might hold. They come to similar conclusions, which is we need to spend more on security, right? Now, this spending more on security while decreasing dependency on the United States, on the one hand, comes with the prospect of, Japan not just going along with any kind of stupid idea that might come from Donald Trump let's say he wants to pull something similar what he does with Iran at the moment or with Venezuela, try to pull a stunt like that in the Pacific with Taiwan. I mean, play with fire, right? There's a chance that Japan now gains the ability to oppose this playing with fire a little bit. There's always constraints, and the Americans have a lot of bases, including in Okinawa, which of course naturally might embroil the Japan into any kind of conflict the US might conjure up. On the other hand, creating more indigenous capacities will of course worry China, and might also worry, by the way, the Koreans, both of them, north and south, and it might also lead to certain worries within Southeast Asia. Although, in my view, the Southeast Asians still have a very positive image of Japan overall, and less of this Second World War memory, at least not to the extent that it is alive in China and also Korea. Colonial memories. So overall, there's both of this, right? But it's clear to me that Japan is going that way, also having increased the defense expenditures from 1% to 2% of GDP over the next 5-6 years. So that will continue, and this process will continue in trying to have security policy in more indigenously produced capacities is going to continue. And I do hope that she will at the same time also continue something else that previous LDP governments did, which is to try, at least on the operational level, military to military, to create at least the possibilities for structured discussions. I mean, Japan, it's little known, but they had like top level exchange, also military to military, and Ministry of Defense to Ministry of Defense. They have regular talks once a year. And the 2 years ago, they opened up a phone hotline so that the ministers of defense could phone each other in case something happened, let's say in the South or East China Sea, right? So that this kind of, even if you don't trust each other, that you work on trust building mechanisms over time to figure out how to jointly administer also the spaces where you heavily disagree. Let's not forget there are territorial disputes about islands. Those won't go away, but I do see the possibility of this mandate for her to actually, to work on Japanese national priorities with a small n, not nationalist priorities, but national priorities, with a little bit less of saber rattling, because she already got the right. And by the way, the very right-wing party, the Sanseto, they also won seats. They went from 2 seats before to 15 seats, so they also increased their share. But that means those very, very strong right-wingers are actually outside of her party, right?
Yeah.
Within the party, I think her wiggle room did increase on both ends.
Yeah, it's an interesting feature of electoral politics where often it's the party that has most sympathies to a position is in the best position to actually change the position. Left-wing parties often a better place to deal with the trade unions than the right-wing parties, and vice versa. Look, one other dynamic in all of this, and we haven't quite gotten there, but I think we're going to open this up to close this conversation. We've talked literally about the spatial or geographical configuration of what is in effect North Asia, Japan, China, and the Korean Peninsula. We've got 2 nuclear powers there and the American nuclear umbrella. We haven't talked about the 3rd nuclear power, which is also a Pacific power, and I mean by that Russia. You've recently published a piece on your Substack, which I think is quite provocative, but nonetheless compels people to think hard about how sometimes reality forces politicians down certain pathways, even if their instincts intuitively wouldn't have taken them there. And your piece, in very simple terms, and I hope you'll elaborate on this, is essentially that many of her priorities, domestically and otherwise, ultimately lead her to having to recalibrate Japan's posture and relationship with Russia.
So even before this election, she actually talked about, one of the first things Takaichi talked about when she became the leader of the LDP is that, well, maybe we should think about having a peace treaty with Russia. It's often forgotten that after the Second World War, Japan actually never signed a peace treaty with the Russians. They, the Soviet-Japanese relationship is quite interesting because they were neutral until the 9th of August 1945, when the Soviets broke the neutrality pact that they had, and then Japan gave up just a few days later, actually. And I belong to the people who think that the entry of the Soviet Union into the war was actually more of a reason than the atomic bombs. But let's put that one aside. So fact is, Russia declared war on Japan. Soviet Union declares war on Japan. Japan then gives up to the Allies, comes under occupation, and then 1953 normalizes relations, becomes sovereign again, but there's never a peace treaty signed. And one of the things that she pitched is like, oh, how about we do a peace treaty with Russia? Now, she didn't really talk about this anymore, but in my piece now, I make that argument that, with this mandate, She now needs to deliver, right, especially on the economic front, and she is also in favor of a weaker Japanese yen to boost the export industry. Fine, but that will automatically mean that a weaker yen means higher import cost of oil. Japan is not energy independent. Oil and gas is very much dependent, like throughout its history. That has always been a very bad problem. And the weaker the yen, the higher the oil prices, and the higher the oil prices, the more the inflation pressure on the real economy, right? Just because like transporting stuff will get more expensive. That means drinks get more expensive, food gets more expensive. The production costs for these chips and wafers in Kumamoto are going to get more expensive. So if you want to actually deliver, you need to find a way to square that circle. And my point there in this article is that Japan has one more card it can play, which the Europeans blew up, right? The possible energy links with Russia. They actually have two energy projects, Sakhalin 1 and Sakhalin 2, where they jointly, together with the Russians, explore oil fields, which are kind of in their shared zone in the very north of Hokkaido. When the war in Ukraine it took its full-scale version back in 2022, the Japanese also kind of froze a couple of these projects, and they were thinking about completely abandoning them, but they didn't. And yes, they put sanctions on Russia, just like the rest of the West, but they actually never sent weapons to Ukraine, never. They actually lived up to their peace constitution also in this sense and said, like, no, we send humanitarian goods to Ukraine and we put economic sanctions on Russia, but we will refrain from sending weapons. So the Japanese never engaged in actually helping the killing of Russians.
They also asked their G7 colleagues for dispensation, didn't they, so that they could continue accessing the resources from the Sakhalin project.
They did, so that they wouldn't have to force their large conglomerates from selling the shares in this project, right? So in a sense, Japan never burned its bridges with Russia as much as the Europeans did, and you could try to go back to that. You could try the projects themselves are still working. You can try to increase those, and you can try to mend fences with Russia, especially now that the United States is actually taking a more reconciliatory approach towards Russia. Although I must say, what we are learning recently is that the Russians are now kind of much more pessimistic about this because Mr. Lavrov actually just gave an interview in which he said, look, the Americans actually never treat us better. They're actually just increasing the pressure, just like before they increased the sanctions, and they're threatening India. They're threatening partners who buy oil from us. They board our ships, our oil tankers. So in reality, the United States is just as hostile as before. And of course, this dampens the prospects also for Japan to be able to do more. But nevertheless, I mean, she might have some wiggle room there as well, because she actually has not a bad relationship with Donald Trump, at least not yet. The relationship between Japan and the United States is rather good. The US still looks at Japan as as a downstream ally, right? So this might just be the window of opportunity needed in order to quietly, not with fanfare, not with large announcements, but quietly rekindle that relationship if that decision was taken. Japan was never a Russophobe country, and you can feel that very clearly. When I'm in Europe, I do feel how a lot of people just don't like Russians. They're just very, very anti-Russian. You see that in a lot of the policies that were taken on the EU level, right? Really downright, with a lot of eager to hurt Russia. Japan never had that. Also on social policies, in my Kyoto University, my institute, last year, 1.5 years ago, they hired a Russian researcher from Russia just because she's good. She's good at what she does, so she could be hired. I mean, no university is punished in Japan for hiring Russian researchers. They face other hurdles, like because of how do you pay for things, because the cards don't work and so on. But it's not. Japan never tried to be nasty to Russians out the way the Europeans did, and I do think this might open certain possibilities. We will see if this is where she wants to go. But it was interesting that she indicated last year that she was talking about this Russia relationship. So that gives me a hint that it's somehow on her mind. And if you think about it, like building up a working relationship with Russia is also a way of actually, reassuring China. It's a way of even reassuring the Koreans to some extent, the North Koreans, with which Russia now has a security treaty. So it would make sense. Whether or not they see it that way too is another question. But I do think that wiggle room just might also have opened up.
It seems that the big majority that she has achieved has delivered her actually an incredible amount of wriggle room to do things that perhaps were unimaginable for not only herself but her predecessors. Let's see how it unfolds over the next 3 to 6 months. I mean, mandates, of course, are fragile things, particularly in a world where change is afoot and stability and predictability is is rare. Pascal Lottaz, I know it's late. Thank you very much for joining us after a long flight and sharing with us the insights about Japanese domestic politics, but how it also plays out across our region. Thank you again for joining me.
Thank you, Warwick.
Hey, everybody. Spreading the news and getting the message out is really a community effort. I'd really appreciate it if you could like, comment, or subscribe, and subscribe, in fact, to the channel. It would really help give the algorithm a nudge along. Thanks very much.